Sarah Whitfield was sitting alone on a park bench on a Tuesday afternoon, watching other mothers push their children on the swings, in the same playground where her own son Ethan used to spend every Saturday morning, when a stranger sat down beside her and asked, gently, if she was all right. A question that broke something loose in her that 6 months of careful, controlled composure had been holding together by sheer force of will. She hadn't meant to cry in front of a stranger. She hadn't meant to explain, in halting, humiliated fragments, that she'd lost custody of her 8-year-old son 4 months earlier, that she now saw him every other weekend, under supervision she hadn't earned and didn't deserve, that she'd spent every day since replaying the exact sequence of mistakes that had cost her the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Sarah's closest friend since college, Priya, had watched the custody loss devastate her friend over the preceding months, showing up for every supervised visitation handoff she could manage around her own work schedule, providing the kind of steady, uncomplicated support Sarah desperately needed but rarely felt she deserved. "You need to stop apologizing for needing help," Priya told her more than once, usually after another difficult exchange with Derek at the designated visitation center, watching Sarah fold in on herself with guilt that had never actually been hers to carry. "None of this happened because you're a bad mother, Sarah. It happened because the system failed you at the exact moment you needed it most." The supervised visits themselves carried their own particular grief, an hour and a half every other Saturday, monitored by a court-appointed supervisor. Ethan, increasingly confused and hurt by an arrangement he was too young to fully understand, asking questions Sarah didn't know how to answer without either lying to him or burdening an 8-year-old with the full weight of an adult legal battle. She spent most of these visits fighting back tears, determined not to let Ethan see how much the situation was breaking her, a performance of composure that left her emotionally wrung out for days afterward. It was after one particularly difficult visit, Ethan crying as the supervisor gently but firmly ended their time together, that Sarah had found herself at the park, sitting alone on the bench where Michael would find her an hour later. The stranger's name was Michael Reyes, a family law attorney 2 years into a solo practice he'd built specifically to help parents who couldn't afford the aggressive representation their exes could, a career choice rooted in his own childhood, watching his mother lose a custody battle she should have won, undone by a lawyer too inexperienced and underfunded to counter his father's expensive legal team. He listened to Sarah's story with a stillness that felt, to her, like the first time in months anyone had actually paid attention, rather than simply judging. He didn't know, sitting on that park bench offering his card and a promise to review her case files, that the woman he'd just met would become the reason he stopped believing his own carefully maintained rule about never mixing his professional cases with anything personal. And Sarah didn't know that the stranger's help would lead not just to reclaiming her son, but to a love she genuinely believed, after everything, she no longer had the capacity to trust. Sarah's custody loss had unfolded with the particular, devastating momentum of a crisis compounding on itself. She'd struggled with postpartum depression after Ethan's birth, a diagnosis she'd been properly treated for and had fully recovered from years earlier, but one her ex-husband, Derek's legal team had resurrected during their divorce proceedings, painting a distorted, outdated picture of her mental fitness that ignored years of stability since. The timing had been catastrophic. Sarah had lost her marketing job during a round of corporate layoffs just months before the custody hearing, a coincidental financial instability that Derek's lawyer had woven into a narrative of chaos and unreliability that Sarah, representing herself with an overwhelmed public defender who had 40 other cases competing for his attention, had been unable to adequately counter. The judge had granted Derek primary custody, citing his financial stability and Sarah's concerning recent history a ruling that had devastated Sarah in ways she was still, months later, struggling to fully process. She'd spent the time since rebuilding, methodically securing a new, stable position at a local nonprofit, attending therapy consistently, saving carefully toward the legal fees she'd need to petition for a custody modification, though the process felt, most days, like screaming into a system that had already decided who she was and wasn't inclined to reconsider. Michael Reyes had built his entire practice around cases exactly like Sarah's parents, disproportionately mothers, who'd lost custody not because they were unfit, but because they'd been out-lawyered during a moment of genuine but temporary crisis. His own mother's custody battle, decades earlier, had ended with Michael and his sister placed primarily with a father who'd gone on to treat them with a cold, transactional distance that made clear the custody fight had never really been about wanting them, only about winning against his ex-wife. Michael had watched his mother spend years fighting, unsuccessfully, to reverse a decision built on his father's superior legal resources rather than any genuine assessment of parental fitness, and had built his entire career trying to make sure fewer families experienced that same devastating imbalance. He still visited his mother most Sundays, a woman who'd rebuilt her own life eventually but who carried, even decades later, a particular grief about the years she'd missed with her children during their formative adolescence. She'd been the one, more than anyone, who'd encouraged Michael's law school ambitions once she understood the direction he wanted to take his career, telling him more than once that if his work could spare even a handful of families the pain hers had endured, it would mean something significant had come out of an otherwise senseless loss. "I want to be honest with you about what this process looks like," Michael told her during their first formal consultation at his modest storefront office a week after their park bench conversation. "Custody modifications are difficult. Judges are reluctant to disrupt established arrangements, even when the original ruling was flawed. This will take time, and it will require you to be relentlessly, meticulously prepared. But based on what you've told me, and what I've seen in your case file, I don't think the original ruling reflected who you actually are as a parent. I think it reflected who you were during the worst 4 months of your life, presented by a lawyer skilled at making temporary crisis look like permanent character." He slid a folder across the desk toward her, thick with notes he'd already begun compiling from their initial conversation. "I've started outlining what we'll need. It's a lot, Sarah. I won't pretend otherwise. But I think it's winnable, and I don't say that lightly." "Why does this matter so much to you?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the intensity of his commitment to a case that, she suspected, wasn't going to be particularly lucrative for a struggling solo practice. "You could take easier cases, ones that pay better." "My mother lost a fight like this one," Michael admitted, more openly than she expected. "I watched it destroy her. Watched a system that was supposed to protect children instead just reward whoever could afford the better lawyer. I built this practice specifically for cases like yours, Sarah. This is exactly why I do this." The months that followed required a partnership built on considerably more than professional formality. Michael working evenings and weekends without additional charge, building a meticulous case documenting Sarah's therapy records, her stable new employment, character references from colleagues and friends, everything necessary to demonstrate the sustained, genuine stability that the original hearing had failed to capture. Sarah, in turn, found herself increasingly leaning on Michael not just as her attorney, but as one of the only people who'd witnessed the full, unvarnished reality of her struggle without flinching or judging. The work itself was tedious and emotionally exhausting in equal measure, combing through months of therapy notes, compiling pay stubs and performance reviews from her new job, drafting and redrafting witness statements from friends and colleagues willing to speak to her character. Michael approached each piece with a thoroughness that occasionally moved Sarah to tears, recognizing in his meticulous care an investment that went well beyond what any reasonable billing rate could account for. I keep thinking about how different things might have looked if I'd had someone like you from the beginning, Sarah told him one evening, the two of them going through documentation at his office long after his usual hours. A takeout dinner between them that had become a regular feature of their working sessions. Instead of a public defender who barely knew my name by the third hearing, she pushed a stack of papers aside, rubbing her tired eyes. I used to blame myself constantly for not fighting harder the first time. Priya's been trying to get me to stop doing that for months. Priya sounds like a good friend, Michael said, and for what it's worth, you didn't fail the first time. The system failed you. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one when you're the person living through it. The system fails people like you constantly, Michael said, something raw in his voice. It's the reason I do this work, even though it means eating a lot of takeout dinners in an office that could really use better lighting. Sarah laughed despite the heaviness of the conversation, a genuine, unguarded sound that had become increasingly rare in her life over the past difficult year. You're very good at making an awful situation feel slightly less awful, she observed. I don't know if I've properly thanked you for that. You don't need to thank me, Michael said, though I'll admit, somewhere in the past 2 months, working your case stopped feeling purely professional to me, which is a line I've been very careful never to cross in 6 years of practicing family law. The admission hung in the air between them, both of them aware of the particular complexity it introduced an attorney-client relationship, already unusually intimate, given the sustained proximity the case required, now edging towards something neither of them had planned or particularly felt equipped to navigate responsibly. I don't know what to do with that information right now, Sarah admitted honestly. I'm in the middle of the most important fight of my life, Michael. I can't afford to complicate it, even with something that might genuinely matter. I understand, Michael said, pulling back with visible effort. The case comes first. Whatever this is, it can wait until Ethan comes home. That's not a burden I want you carrying on top of everything else. They maintained a careful, professional distance in the weeks that followed. The unspoken tension between them channeled instead into an even more relentless focus on Sarah's case. Michael building what would become one of the most thoroughly documented custody modification petitions the county courts had seen in years. The hearing date arrived in early spring, nearly 8 months after their initial park bench meeting. Sarah more prepared and more genuinely hopeful than she'd allowed herself to feel throughout the entire painful process. She'd spent the days beforehand reviewing her testimony with Michael until she could recite the key facts of her recovery without her voice shaking, though nothing could fully prepare her for the anxiety of sitting across the courtroom from Derek again, his expensive attorney beside him with the same confident bearing that had won the original case. The hearing itself proved grueling, Derek's attorney attempting to resurrect the same tired narrative of instability, only to find Michael prepared with counter-evidence for every claim. Character witnesses who spoke to Sarah's genuine growth and stability. Documentation so thorough it left little room for the vague, character-based insinuations that had won the original case. Michael called Sarah's therapist her nonprofit supervisor, and 2 close friends including Priya, each testimony methodically dismantling the narrative Derek's attorney had tried to rebuild, painting instead a clear, consistent picture of a mother who had done exactly the sustained, difficult work of rebuilding her life that the court should have recognized from the beginning. Ethan himself, now old enough for the judge to consider his stated preference, expressed clearly and consistently his wish to live primarily with his mother, a factor that, combined with Michael's meticulous case, finally tipped the ruling decisively in Sarah's favor. Watching her son speak with quiet earnest conviction about wanting to come home. Sarah had to fight to hold her composure, aware of how much courage it had taken an 8-year-old to say something so significant in a room full of adults, deciding his future. The judge's ruling, granting Sarah primary custody with a revised, generous visitation schedule for Derek, arrived with a relief so overwhelming that Sarah found herself sobbing in the courthouse hallway, Michael standing beside her with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something considerably more personal. Ethan, released from the separate waiting room where children were kept during proceedings, ran into her arms the moment the ruling was announced, the two of them holding onto each other in a way that drew quiet, sympathetic smiles from courthouse staff who'd clearly witnessed enough painful outcomes to recognize a genuinely happy one when they saw it. "You did this," Michael told her, once she'd composed herself enough to speak, Ethan still clinging to her side. "I built the case, but you're the one who did the actual work, the therapy, the stability, showing up every single day for 8 months, proving exactly who you actually are. I just made sure the judge finally got to see it clearly. I couldn't have done any of it without you," Sarah said. "Michael, you gave up months of billable hours, evenings, weekends, all for a case that barely covered your office overhead. I don't know how to properly thank you for giving me my son back." "You don't owe me anything," Michael said. "This is exactly the work I built my practice to do." "I know," Sarah said, "but I think we both know this stopped being purely about the case a while ago." She paused, gathering the courage the ruling had somehow unexpectedly given her. "You said the case had to come first. It doesn't anymore, Michael. Ethan's coming home, and I find myself wanting to actually explore whatever this is between us. If you're still interested, now that I'm not asking you to be my attorney while also asking you to be anything else." Michael's careful, professional composure finally broke into something unmistakably warmer. "I've been interested since the park bench," he admitted. "I just needed your case resolved before I let myself say so properly." "Sarah, I don't take on cases like yours lightly, and I definitely don't fall for my clients. This is the first time in 6 years of practice this has happened, and I want you to know that's not a line I cross casually." "I believe you," Sarah said, and closed the distance between them. The courthouse hallway, an unlikely but somehow perfectly fitting place for the culmination of 8 months of careful, deliberate restraint, finally giving way to something neither of them wanted to hold back any longer. 6 months later, Ethan had settled fully back into life with his mother, thriving in a stability that Sarah had fought so hard to rebuild, splitting weekends amicably with his father under an arrangement considerably healthier than the contentious original ruling had produced. Priya, who'd stood beside Sarah through the entire ordeal, made a point of thoroughly interrogating Michael at the small celebration dinner Sarah organized once the ruling became final, though her stern questioning gradually gave way to genuine warmth once she saw how naturally he'd settled into Ethan's life. "I was fully prepared to give you the 3rd degree," Priya told him, "but watching you help him with his math homework earlier, unprompted, kind of undercut my whole interrogation plan." "I'll take that as a passing grade," Michael said, laughing. "Provisional passing grade," Priya corrected. "I reserve the right to revoke it if you ever make her cry the way Derek's lawyer did." Michael had become a steady, welcome presence in both their lives, careful and patient in building his own relationship with Ethan at a pace the boy set himself, understanding intuitively the particular sensitivity required after everything the family had been through. He started gradually joining them for Sunday dinners, then homework help on weeknights, never rushing the transition, always attentive to the fact that Ethan's trust, given everything the boy had witnessed during the custody battle, needed to be earned patiently rather than assumed. Sarah occasionally volunteered now at Michael's practice, offering her own story to other parents navigating the same devastating system that had nearly cost her everything. A living testament to the fact that a temporary crisis, properly understood and properly represented, doesn't have to define a parent's entire future. She found unexpected purpose in these conversations, recognizing in each nervous, frightened parent who walked through Michael's door the exact desperation she'd once felt on that park bench, and taking quiet pride in being able to offer them something she hadn't had at the start of her own fight, proved that the system could, with the right advocate and enough persistence, still be made to work. And some evenings, watching Michael help Ethan with his homework at their kitchen table, an ordinary domestic scene that had once felt impossibly out of reach, Sarah would think about the stranger who'd sat down beside her on a park bench during the worst months of her life, and feel nothing but gratitude that he'd chosen that particular Tuesday to simply ask if she was all right.